You are now listening
to the Black Male Educators Alliance podcast.
Lifting our voices.
Lifting our voices.
Welcome and Happy New Year. This is the BMEA Podcast, Lifting Our Voices. I am your co-host, Michael Payne, and I'm here with the great and honorable Dr. Curtis L. Lewis. My guy, how you doing, man? Happy New Year.
What up, man? How are you?
Hey, I'm good. I just got a haircut, so that's why I'm a little extra.
I see you like extra, like
yeah. That's why we had to shoot the podcast today.
Gotcha.
So
okay,
I appreciate it. But we got a special episode today. We got a guest who's been a part of BMEA since the beginning. I want to state that first. He's been vital to like not only our board, but also just our events and our programming. And I'm gonna stop talking, let him go. But Dr. Karlin Tichenor, how you doing, man?
I'm good, man. How you doing? Happy New Year.
We are so glad to have you here, man, as a friend and also as an expert in what you do. Can you tell people a little bit about the work that you do?
Yeah, I actually hate this part. I don't like reading resumes. So I'll just be brief. So my background is mental health. I'm a couple and family therapist by trade, studied in human development family studies at Go Green, Go White. If you don't know where that is,
Go Green.
You need to Google it. It's Michigan State University. But so there I studied, but then I got the opportunity to work in schools for about 10 years and implementing programs around mental health, social emotional learning and development, and supporting adults as they support youth. So that's most of my background. Now I'm outside of K-12 as a direct employee and running a consulting firm and then a social services agency in Indianapolis.
Man, that's dope, man. I hope you don't mind asking, when you were younger, did you feel like that was what you were going to get into?
No, I actually didn't. I was, I think as I got to college, I started learning more about the topics through some elective courses, which I think are really important for people to take elective courses. Because you might think you know what you want to do, you take some core classes and you realize that's not it. I remember like taking like even a Cinemax class, right? Learning how to do movies while taking psychology classes. And when I took those classes, I was like, I actually really like this stuff. It was hard to memorize the concepts, but I enjoyed the material and I enjoyed understanding human behavior. But I still didn't know I wanted to be a therapist by no means. But I remember I was a resident assistant. You guys know what those are, right? Like those are the folks that you're responsible to and who's responsible for the floor of the building. They get a stipend, which I would advocate. If you go to college, become a resident assistant so you could save some money. But while I was doing that, people would come in my room and they would talk about stuff, different things. And I, for some reason, knew the question to ask. And so I found I was enjoying having those conversations with people. And then I applied to graduate school not to be a therapist. Long story short, I went through this program, this McNair-Schropp program at Michigan State. And while I was there, I took a youth development class. And that youth development class was in the Human Development Family Studies program. And while I was there, they started talking about this marriage and family therapy program. And I was like, that probably would be interesting to me. And so when I started taking those classes, they were just like the classes I took in college. And they definitely made me feel like that was it.
Yeah, you said a lot of good points. That a reason why I asked you is because Curtis and I were talking earlier just about, guys coming out of high school and not really knowing what they wanted to do. We had a podcast, in the barbershop about that, right? And you mentioned like kind of like having the class that sparked the interest in college, right? Yeah. But a lot of our brothers and sisters aren't really having an opportunity to get to that point, right? And so then what we have is this generation of adults or this population of adults who are post-high school, living in an adult world with like kind of aimlessly, right? And so our podcast today is kind of touching on that topic, but how it relates to mental health and how it relates to like the violence that we have in our community, right? So I want to to play a clip really quickly. Unfortunately, a woman who's pretty, regardless of whether she's popular, a woman who was loved in the community of Detroit was killed earlier. I think it was last year actually, by carjacking, and I played a clip and we'll talk about it for a little bit.
She was special, amazing. She was my rock.
And now his wife, Tracy Golden, is gone.
I really can't explain them because if you've never lost a spouse, you wouldn't know that feeling. It's new to me.
This video, the final moments of her life. Wednesday, she stopped into the Beverage One liquor store off Grand River near Outer Drive. Detroit police say a man ambushes her, shooting Tracy in the chest. He rifled through her pockets, then drove off in her SUV. In her final moments, she told the responding officer, "Call my husband, John."
she knew she was always my heart from 86 to 2000 infinity. So, my heart.
Their story, a true love story. College sweethearts going separate ways and rekindling their romance after 30 years to get married after all.
Anyone that knows her and knows me and know our relationship, we were one.
Tracy leaves behind a 19-year-old daughter who tells Fox 2 she is surrounding herself with family and friends too broken to speak with us. Sadly, Tracy died at Sinai Grace Hospital, where she worked for years as a respiratory therapist. Co-workers looked on as she was rushed into the ER where she died. And before her murder, a beloved union steward.
I had no idea how many people loved my wife.
Tracy's SUV was found abandoned in the parking lot of a Detroit dollar store. Investigators are scouring for the suspect from that video of Tracy's final moments. We asked John if he had anything to say to the shooter.
I can't say nothing. Come on in, bruh, before it's too late.
Detroit police say they could use your help with this one. They did put out sort of a cryptic message on social media Friday directed at anybody that might be helping or harboring this shooter. They too could face charges. Jessica Dupnack, Fox 2 News.
Yeah, so let me just get your initial thoughts before I ask any questions.
And I chuckle not because it's nothing funny at all about this. I think when I initially saw this, and this was right around Christmas, I think. I can't remember, right towards the end of the year.
Yeah.
And when I saw it on the news, man, I was immediately upset, extremely upset. Yeah. For a number of reasons, because that could be any of our moms and us, and carjackings unfortunately happen all across this country all the time, right? So we know that this happens, but to just see this lady, going into the store, hoping to get in her car and go home, and some random person just comes and you see him, take out his weapon, and I began to process who would do something like this, right? And I started to talk like that, man, this idea of people walking around here soulless, and how do we? Where does that come from? I know we're going to get into that a little bit, but that's what I just thought about. Someone whose soul is, who also, they can't have a soul, one that is loving and caring to do that, right? It wasn't it was just I'm walking, I'm going to do this, I'm going to shoot you and take your car. And it just really, it's just unfortunate. And I just think it's just the way, I think we can't continue to sit back and be like, this is okay. Right, and I think we get we're so familiar or used to this happening all the time that we just become desensitized. And it's like, oh well, right, and it's always a story for a week and then we forget about it. And I don't want this for whatever reason to just go by the wayside, because I think it's a larger conversation we got to start having.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think you spoke about seeing it from her perspective, what this was my mom or my sister or somebody I know. And I was thinking, what if these is one of the boys I used to teach, right? And
that did it.
Right. You know what I mean? Because I think I won't say it's easy to empathize with the woman, because I do, but I think so in terms of solving the problem, we got to think about the shooter, right? And in my mind is what makes him soulless? How do you get to the soulless? I'm not saying what makes him soulless. I think obviously you can get to that point, but how do we get to this point? And what are we doing as a community? Or what can we do as a community to wrap our arms around our brothers? Because I tell people all the time, I was education, schools are not an educator's problem. It's everybody's problem. Because our children that we are working with in these schools, they're going to go out into the world. Prepared, not prepared, happy, sad, angry, violent. They're going to go into the world. So now they have to be with all of us in this society. So it's what can we do to really, I guess, I don't know if you can, I don't want to say solve or save, but it's what can we do to turn the tide on the violence that we see? Not only just with young people, because I think I do want to talk about is there a young thing, but just in our community in general.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge. So when I heard about the story, you guys were telling me more details about it before the show. I didn't know all the details of it, and I think I'm still processing the details of it. as we speak. And so, first of all, my condolences to the family and to the community and any of those folks who know her personally, but then also folks who heard the story and are experiencing their own kind of re-traumatization of that, right? Like we don't talk about re-traumatization enough. And yet every time you might turn on the news, you're re-traumatized. You know, things that happened in your life or has recently happened or is happening, you turn on the story of the news and it's reminding you of your own stuff in addition to the stuff that you're hearing and trying to empathically connect with that individual and their story. So definitely my condolences to everyone who's impacted, even all of us who are having the conversation right now, because I'll probably be processing it for the rest of the night, if not the rest of the week. I don't know if the solutions are simple, right? Like all the questions that you guys asked so far are really important questions. How does the person become? How does she prevent this from happening? Could she ever? Could it be any of us? Yes. I'm not sure how we prevent it, right? Like there's a lot of answers that will probably not resolve our emotions because it's so complicated, right? And I was thinking of like when you guys asked me to come on the show, like what's the data around violence? Do we think it's more violent in our communities now? Do we? Then let's say 1990. Is it more violent?
Well, in some instances they are saying there's more violent crimes, and especially since 2020, since the pandemic. They've talked about in some areas, so maybe it's less murders, but it's more carjackings or thefts or rape or whatever the case may be. So I think overall violence has seemed to be rising, and in some cities more than others.
That's a good point. Yeah, to your point, I would say like the 90s were a violent era, right?
Yeah.
In the 80s and 90s, especially in the crack epidemic. But there's data that might point to, especially dealing with like the police, and there data might point to that like, there's a drop in homicides or there's a drop in crimes. But I do feel like our country has become more gun desensitized.
Sure.
And so there is no increase in gun without increase in violence. Like it doesn't, you know what I mean? There is and I think when there's a statistic around like children being killed in the household is usually like self-inflicted wounds from a gun, you know what I mean? So it's like I think the guns are one thing, and that's another topic, but I also think that like mentally are we unwell to the point where it's just like there's a soullessness happening in a generation?
And it's an interesting question because when I started looking at the data, because I wanted to know, like, I know my opinion, right? Violence is worse. Like, I think it's worse. And every time we turn on the TV, it tells us it's worse. And it's getting younger and younger in terms of those who transgress the violence. But fact remains, the peak season was 83 to 93, where the violence was at its highest. It has stayed pretty static, if not decreased since then. So the truth is violence hasn't gotten worse. Type of violence has changed, right? And then who's doing the violence has gotten younger. And we have more information about the violence, right? We can watch it on media. We can tell it on the television. We can do a YouTube video. We can hear a podcast about it. We can open up the newspaper, if we even open up newspapers anymore. But it's constantly around us because we have more information. In addition to that, the kind of information we have is like this. They do a lot more youth violence surveys. They ask kids now in schools, what are you thinking about violence? Have you ever been bullied? Have you ever bullied? Have you ever been in a fight? How many times? Like, these are informations that we now have access to that makes us more hyper aware of the violence, right? The CDC even puts out national surveys to get information from young people about violence. And then we see all these productions of violence reports, right? So the data says violence hasn't gotten worse. We're more aware. Is it still a problem? Absolutely. My point around that is not to say it's not a problem. My point is to say it's been this way for a long time. And we need to have a deeper discussion around why does it continue to persist and what's happening in families and communities that is creating the likelihood that violence continues to persist. That's something that I think about.
Yeah, I think too, and that's a good point. So I think too, when we talk about violence, it also needs to be contextualized to the particular context that you're talking about too. Because I know, like, for example, my hometown, Chicago, it has definitely been way more murders than it's been 20 years ago, right? Detroit has been fluctuating up and down. So I think I want to bring to the table, although overall it may be, there is particular communities where that's not the case.
That's true.
Right? And so I think it's important, and because of this incident that we were referring to happened in Detroit, and we know there's in some cities, there's been an uptick, and particularly in Chicago too. And to your point around the youth that are involved in carjacking, like there's like 12 and 11-year-olds carjacking. Yeah. Like that's crazy, right? My son is 8. Like 3 more years, like he's like what, right? Yeah. And so I think it's important for us to begin to think about, in particular, context.
Absolutely.
Why this might be going down.
That's huge,
right?
Yeah, and let me clarify, right? The data I was talking about is national data on average, right?
Exactly.
And so the context is very, very important.
Yeah. No, and so because when you think about if New York's going down, Chicago's rising, they might average out.
Sure, sure.
Like California, LA, you might have been worse in the 80s and 90s than it is now. But to absolutely your point, and I think you both said it. Like the data is showing that the kids are getting younger that are committing these crimes, and I think that schools and education it has to be a part of the conversation now. Like we talk about like academics, we kind of talk about social emotional learning,
depending on the context.
Right? And I guess violence or community is not in that picture, but it needs to be.
Why are we always going back to schools though?
I thought BMEA was founded on that basis. But I hear you.
Sort of.
Right.
But why? I hear you, but like, why do we always? There's a violence problem in the city of Detroit. Schools.
Sure.
There's this problem. Schools. Like, I'm asking. Like,
no. I do have an answer to that. There is, to me, unless we ask the church to do it. What institutions do the communities have when we come together to talk about general, like, social issues? Like, what affects all of us? We don't have communities no more. People don't stay in communities no more. All right, not saying
transiency. You mean like transiency?
Yes, yeah. like because the world is so connected, we're so much further apart. Yeah. You can move cities. I've lived in 6-7 cities, right? People I grew up in Delaware, I don't know what's going on with them anymore. But when we talk about what's happening with 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds, the only place there's any type of like common space is in the schools, right? And they're public and they're paid for by our taxes. So to me, whatever it is we want to happen in schools should be happening in schools because we pay for it.
And it's a captive audience.
Say it again.
Theoretically, it's a captive audience.
Yeah, they're already there listening. You know what I mean? Yeah. I don't know what they're listening to, but they're listening. So I don't think I think it's school's responsibility? No, I think it's family's responsibility. I think it's how you raise your children. But do I think school is a place where we can like start to try to implement some solutions to like help? Right? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There are a lot of people raising kids who should not be raising kids. There are a lot of people raising kids
trying to go there
who ain't supposed to be raising kids.
Trying to go there.
But if they come into my space or they come into my school, as an educator, you have an opportunity to impact them in a positive way.
But listen to this, y'all.
Go ahead.
And it's great, like great points. Like I love it. But like, so you got to come to school and you got to learn all the content, right? Then I got to teach you how to like get along with everybody. Mm-hmm. Then they need mental health issues you may have, any social services you may have. Like teach you how not to be violent, like all that stuff, right? And if there's violence in your community, we need to talk about that in school too, right? What we really getting done in school?
If you subtract all the violence and conversations you're talking about, and you still talking on the content, and you still got kids that are lost, what are you talking about anyway?
Fair.
And so, because I think your point is the point that's always going to be made is like we don't have enough time to talk about
it. It ain't enough about time. We don't have no resources.
Absolutely.
We is like as Dr. Tichenor brought up. We were established to increase part of the reason to increase diversify the profession. So you got folks oftentimes that are not even coming from these communities, are not even familiar with these communities, and we're putting all this on them. School of Ed, let's go there. Ain't teaching people how to do this work, right? Sure. Yeah. And so like we could throw everything in the school because that's what I think we're sort of apt to do all the time. Like we just do that. But to what end? Like who's getting trained and supported to do this work? When and that would cause us. We talked about this a few episodes ago about like transforming schools, rethinking schools. That would really do what you're talking about. We got to rethink how we do school.
No doubt. That's my point. No, yes.
Because what we doing right now, this ain't gonna work.
Yes.
There's no space for it.
But I don't think there's not a world or a scenario on which I think that the way schools are built needs to continue anyway.
I mean,
every conversation. No, I know.
Right. Yeah,
every conversation we have and every problem that comes up, it's because I'm thinking in the lens of like how we're doing school is not right. I think I'm wholeheartedly on that. So shifting it, the question is, all right. So what do we need to talk about? What does need to happen? And I will say that there are programs and there are people that are trying to do the anti-violence in the community. There are organizations, New Era, Detroit, like shouting them out. Yeah. Like there are the organizations that do that. But I do think in terms of like education, like what do our kids learn? I think mental health is a part of that, right? And I think under that scope of mental health, dealing with conflict, dealing with trauma, dealing with depression, dealing with hopelessness, right? Dealing with peer pressure.
I think they learn all of that in school.
Huh?
They learn all of it in schools.
They learn it.
They learn all that.
They learn it
how to be
regardless
violent. Sometimes they learn how to be violent in school.
They learn it regardless whether or not you're specifically teaching it. Kids are always learning. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? You're absolutely right because they learn from each other too. You know what I mean? So it and to that point of school and violence, I know you guys saw the national news about the 6-year-old in Virginia. I'm gonna let us go to the clip real quick for the audience.
Police in Virginia trying to figure out how a 6-year-old got a hold of a loaded gun and shot his teacher. This happened inside of a first grade classroom. Fox News correspondent Christina Coleman has that story.
The teacher, Abigail Zwerner, is now listed in stable condition after suffering life-threatening injuries from that shooting. Police say a 6-year-old shot her with a handgun in a first-grade classroom Friday afternoon at Richnick Elementary School in Newport News, Virginia. It's unclear exactly what led up to the shooting, though police do say this was an isolated incident and that some sort of altercation took place.
The altercation was between a 6-year-old, the student who did have the firearm, and the teacher, and then a round was fired. Like I said, she suffered a gunshot wound and has been transported to the hospital. That's where my thoughts and prayers are at right now.
We need to keep the guns out of the hands of our young people. This is evidence today that these are the things that happen when we have access to weapons.
Police say this was not an accidental shooting. It's unclear how the 6-year-old boy gained access to a loaded gun. The devastating incident, of course, rocking the community.
I'm in awe and I'm in shock, and I'm disheartened. The day was really a breakdown in what our values are as a community, what our values are as a city, and what our values are as a school division.
District officials say the elementary school will be closed Monday and Tuesday to allow time to heal.
Well, first of all, condolences to the lady that was harmed, shot in the school. It doesn't feel like it's an educational topic. It feels like a gun law topic. But where are we at where 6-year-olds are shooting people with guns?
Where are we at that a 6-year-old knows how to use a gun? Where are we at that a 6-year-old has access to a gun? Where are we at that his parents, if he has caregivers that are there with him in the morning before he goes to school, are not aware of that he has taken something that should be protected and locked up, right? If you ever take a gun class, if you are an owner, you are educated to lock up your gun and then to remove the clip and then to take out the bullets, especially when you have children. Like that's base, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things that happened to get him to the point where he was able to do that. Let's back all the way up. What was wrong with his feelings and ability to express himself such that he needed to use this as a way to tell her that he was upset?
Yeah, that's right? What I was wondering.
I mean, so all of that is important to think about. Like, we can focus on the gun part, but we also have to talk about the fact that this little kid had no ability to express himself in a way that allowed her to hear him without him feeling like he needed to be violent toward her. Yeah. Not only violent, because we see kids hit teachers and educators, right? Yeah. He said, I want to end her life. Now, you could say, does a 6-year-old know what he or she is doing? Mm-hmm. Do you guys think?
I know some smart 6-year-olds.
Yeah, me too. I do too.
I think my son at 6 knew.
He would.
If this is a real gun.
Yeah, he knew. Yeah,
but he knows now. He's 8. Like, I think he knows that.
Right.
Right.
And
but
I think so too. I think that he is maybe aware that this will cause harm.
Yes.
Yeah. This is a bad choice.
This is a bad choice. Yes. This will cause harm, and it's gonna hurt.
Yeah.
Now, does he say, I want to kill her? I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know that kid's brain. But he at least knows enough to know that there's a consequence, and this consequence is going to be bad.
Yeah.
However you define bad, right? So to me, like the conversation, that's why I think schools shouldn't get all the responsibility, because schools are microcosms of society. Society is a microcosm of school, and schools exist in community. You used the word contextualization earlier. Like in the context of schools, there is a community, a broader community that has social problems that show up and manifest in schools. So can schools solve all the social problems that manifest as a result of their community? No. Are they a part of it? Yes. Do they now fulfill a role that social organizations and churches should have, used to, could have filled? Yes. But what's happened in society, though, over the last 40 years that I think is important to talk about is the disillusion of family and the reduction of parenting skill, right? We have younger and younger parents who were not always parented well, who then develop the skill that they learned from their parents, and they either swing the pendulum fully to the right, where they're completely permissive, they have no boundaries, or they're completely to the left, where they're overly aggressive, controlling, and abusive. And so we're not talking about parenting skills. You don't have to have a license to have a kid, right? You don't even have to be a certain age. And then we assume that they have the ability to figure it out. Right. So let's imagine, I don't know this family that raised this 6-year-old. He's one example of many examples, right? We in Indianapolis, since the beginning of the year, 3 shootings of 14, 16-year-old young people. And so again, we talked about it getting lower and lower in age. Kids are more and more aggressive, and they're choosing these kinds of really, really violent things to do in order to express themselves. So if the parents of this 6-year-old, as an example, had more skill, what would they do with those skills to prepare their child specifically to express himself? I would end my comments on this point. I think one of the biggest things is the fact that parents are not knowing how to have conversations around emotional intelligence, self-expression, knowing why you feel what you feel, where you feel it in your body, and the reasons why that's happening, and then giving you alternative solutions to express yourself that allows you to resolve the problem, improve the condition as a result of the way you solve the problem, versus making things worse.
Absolutely. And that starts early.
Very much early.
Before 6.
Language development is what age? You the professor of 5 classes. What age? What age does it start at? Language development. Is it like 3 or 4?
I mean, that's earlier than that.
Okay, so then you're conceptually able to at least understand, right?
When they infants, they're starting to, figure some words out to try to blab out something.
Yeah. So then if it starts there early, then that's when we should have some conversations. Yeah. Right? maybe not like.
With the children? Or with the babies?
Yes, about emotional expression, about how to solve problems, developmentally appropriate. Like, I'm not trying to be complex here, but simple things that help them think about the consequences of their behavior. Like, I was thinking about this thing, like, how many of us have done a study, or not a study, but like an experiment with a kid where you say, blow up the balloon. Like, you just give all kids a balloon, right? And you say, blow it. So, like, the intervention is the air, and the balloon has a natural consequence depending on how much air you put in it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you could pause and say, blow it up a little bit, and then you can ask the question, what happens if you continue to blow up the balloon? Most kids will say it's going to get bigger, right? Okay, what happens if you blow it up over and over again, and it reaches its capacity? The kid would respond by saying it will likely bust. Like, you could have those conversations earlier around, if you do this, then this happens, and as a result, this is the consequence. And all I'm saying is getting kids spaces where they can communicate and understand consequences, but also learn how to express themselves in ways that are helpful, gives them an ability to alternatively select this instead of that.
Man, 2 things. One, to your point, one of my son's favorite books is called The Color Monster. Mm-hmm. And it's a really good book. I recommend it for everyone but little ones, 3 or 4 year olds. But it just goes through the colors and like emotions. And every time he reads it, we talk about like, well, what colors did you feel today, right? Yeah. Just to get him in the habit of being able to like verbalize. And obviously we don't do that with boys in general, much less kids, but just in boys. So I do recommend that, and I think it's helpful. It's been helpful down the road when things have been tough, and he's been able to just verbalize how he feels so that we can support him, right? But the other thing is, I'm thinking about all the conversations I've had with kids when they fought in class, or they got into it with the teacher, or they refused to do something, and there were like a larger consequence to like something that was really like, I was feeling this way, and I didn't know how to express it. I was upset. I was jealous. I was scared. I was hurt. I was whatever I was. And because I wasn't able to address it, my teacher's failing me because me and her don't have a good relationship. Or I got into a fight, so now I'm suspended. Or now I'm expelled because it's the third time I got into a fight because I continually have this emotional breakdown that I don't know how to deal with. How many of our kids go through that, I hate to bring it back, in schools that like send them off into trajectories? They usually end up in prison. How many of our brothers and sisters are in prison because they're not emotionally regulating right? Where do we teach that?
Yeah. Where don't we teach it? I mean, that's really my response is every place that humans exist, we should have spaces where we can have conversations about all of these things because they're human issues, right? Like emotions are innate to us. It's the first thing we do when we breathe in this world is we cry, right? We're exposed to light, it overwhelms our bodies, and we start crying, right? And so if we like normalize the emotional expression, then we start to create spaces where people can just talk about it naturally. And then you develop language around it, right? Like there's this idea of primary emotion, secondary emotion, tertiary emotion. Most people only use primary emotion. I'm happy, I'm sad, and then a couple of other three, right? Most of us can't dig into those emotions and say, I'm actually overwhelmed, I'm frustrated, I'm feeling, a little bit upset and hurt by the fact that you said or did whatever. And then the tertiary is more complicated than that. So all I'm saying is every place needs to have places where we as human beings are talking about how we feel so that it becomes commonplace, normal, where you're demanded of an expression that explains how you feel rather than I feel some kind of way and me interpreting that as I get exactly what you're saying, bro. I feel some kind of way too. Like we got to get away from that. And some of our culture, allows us to reinforce the undermining of emotional expression and emotional intelligence, which creates spaces for people to not know how they feel, but they have the feelings and they don't know what to do with that emotion. And so they express it in ways that are harmful.
I feel like I'm in a therapy session.
Well, you invited a therapist.
I did.
He definitely got a doctor too, Doc.
I know, and I'm like about to ask a personal question. Like, so why did I take on?
Where is my couch? I need my notebook.
That's good though. I think as we bring it back around, going back to what I mentioned earlier, I think to your point, when we don't do that, we create people who don't get to, their souls are like sort of released or they're not aware of them. They're not even given the opportunity to express themselves. Because I think over time and what we're seeing in whether the 6-year-old or other kids across the country and adults, it's like people are not given skill sets or the coping mechanism to be able to deal with their emotions. And then when kids come into this, like in particular schools, teachers don't have the skills to deal with it, right? And we send them down to the social worker. So we got one social worker for 500 kids, right? So we know what that means. Yeah. And so I think it's about us really beginning, because I think I want to really grapple with how do we save the souls? And I hate to use the word save, but I want to say that because I really believe part of the problem is due to schooling, due to the community, due to parenting in some cases. And I'm not here to bash parents. I'm a parent. It is the hardest job ever. You never know you're doing it right or wrong. Sometimes you just, going off of your own experience. I get all that. I really do. But some stuff is just unacceptable.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I may not know what I'm doing, but I'm not leaving the gun in the space where my 6-year-old is going to be able to get it. Like, I'm not going to be irresponsible. And again, I'm not judging the parent. I'm just not. I'm not. Yeah. But I'm also, we got to start holding people accountable. Yeah. And part of loving people, and I've said this before, is we got to hold people accountable. Yeah. And we got to have the tough conversations, right? And so I am an advocate for parents. I know this work is hard. I've done it, and I've been doing it for decades. However, I also know we got to do better, right? Because it is what happened to that lady, what happened to that teacher, is unacceptable. And I believe people need to be held accountable, right? And we got to be able to do that, because if we're talking about love and caring about people, accountability is a big part of that.
So the idea of accountability, I just hope, right, like, any listener is not thinking accountability always means punishment.
Correct.
Right? Like, and one thing that we haven't talked about, and I think as a mental health professional, you're going to hear this word trauma, right? Like, All right, so if I grow up in an environment where I'm exposed to trauma and I'm also not developing skill, I am more likely to engage in behaviors that are harmful to self and others, right? Talk about adverse childhood experiences. There was a study that was done only on white men that found that 1 in 3 had at least one adverse childhood experience. Those are white men who had access to healthcare, who actually were well-to-do financially, generally speaking. 1 in 3, okay? So if we say, all right, like, what would it look like if it was black poor people? Would you think, like, what percentage would have an adverse childhood experience? A higher percentage, you could guess, right? And so then we know that adverse childhood experiences are forms of trauma. And we know those individuals had, like, predispositions to certain chronic health issues, as well as behaviors that would translate in their lives. I bring that up to say, like, trauma is a real reality for many people. So let's use, if we want to, like, follow the story of the person who actually shot the woman. This, nothing that I'm about to say is to justify what he's doing. But soullessness, I would also call, is the presence of significant trauma potentially. An individual who is only trying to address his own needs and only can see those needs being met by this solution, might be medicated by drugs as a result of his history, and he has now become drug addicted and only is trying to solve a problem in this moment, and this is the solution he has, right? So all of that is important for us to think about in community context. Trauma exposure leads to a lower development of the brain, which then creates responses that are not developmentally appropriate, right? And so in simple forms, if someone's traumatized, their brain doesn't develop fully. And as a result, anything that happens after that point, if unaddressed, if there's no intervention, that person is more likely to engage in asocial behaviors that are harmful to themselves or others. And so we have to start talking about trauma. We have to talk about interventions to trauma, and we have to do it in the context of community first before we start talking about it in the context of school. There's not enough mental health professionals present. There's not enough people who accept that mental health is important. We know there's a social stigma in our community. Most of us still don't have a therapist, and we know we need one, right? And so, and I'm not like advocating for a therapist because I'm one. I'm talking about wellness and people who've been exposed to things who need an intervention. And if none of us continue to approach this need for an intervention, we're going to still see many of the things we continue to see in what we're talking about today, which is the consequences of violence that can stem from being exposed to trauma.
And you know what? I think that I'm still kind of wrapping my head around the idea. I keep bringing up school because I always feel like school is the only place we can do it. But that's not true. And I do think that, like, there's an idea around, like, we do need to hold the community accountable because we are connected more now than we probably ever been before. And you have seen signs of people coming together, right? It's just whether or not we choose to or not. And I want to bring this up because you mentioned earlier the Damar Hamlin scenario, right? The young man who got hurt in the NFL game, right? Now, this is a violent sport, so the violence there was unintentional. But what really kind of stood out to me was how easy it was for people to kind of like get on the same page. All right, this is something that is like really serious, and that we need to wrap ourselves around him. School didn't, NFL didn't ask nobody to do that. Like the donations, people's like energy towards it, like outside of the NFL, inside, all of that was, I don't want to say natural, but it was like people didn't
Unfiltered.
have to, people didn't have to do that. So to me, it tells me like we know what community means, and we know the power of community when we decide this is what is like, this is important to us. So to me, what I'm really saying is maybe school doesn't have to be the forefront of it, but we need to say that this is important to us. Violence in our community is important to us. Mental health is important, and we need to just focus on that. I think that, like, one thing I've always said that the black community has been somewhat, like, on the same page about is, like, around policing, right? Because I think it's more obvious and there's, like, rooted in a lot of other things. But it is hard for us to deal with the violence in our own community because it takes a little bit of accountability, and it's somewhat like of a mirror to the things that we haven't dealt with ourselves, our cousins, our families, our children, you know what I'm saying, our neighbors, all those things. So I do think that, like, we do have to get to a place, like, mentally as human beings, as a community, to say, like, all right, this is important. We need to, like, how do we start, like, working on this together?
Yeah. I think there are movements that are trying to address that in local community. You guys mentioned the ones in Detroit, and there's certainly others. Indianapolis has several that are trying to do it. I mean, I think in the times where we are investing in it, I think there's always some pushback in some level. I'm not always sure what the pushback is motivated by. I know that everyone has experienced folks who need mental health services in our own families. And when you think about the Hamlin situation, like, there was no opportunity to look away. I mean, I was watching the game live when I saw it, right? And in the media, everyone was interested in the story. Like, everybody's talking about it. But part of it was this visceral reaction as you watched this individual who is engaging in a violent sport, but that hit wasn't an unnatural hit. There was no immediate impact on his head. I mean, for me, that was like an ordinary tackle. But it had this immediate impact on him, and we all saw it at the same time. Now, maybe not literally at the same time because everybody wasn't watching it live, but it's no different than the George Floyd murder, in my opinion. And we rallied, right? The problem is, and you mentioned this earlier, because we are so desensitized, because we move on quickly, and I think because we navel gaze, like, we're some selfish people, right? So we move past things very quickly because we get right back into our default, which is what's happening with me, right? And so I think that's part of the community story too, is we get connected, we get impactful, we get a desire to come and want to rally around to address issues, but then after a while it fizzles out, right? George Floyd was how long ago? How many people are still investing in that work, right? And so I think part of it is we need to have a sustained effort, and we need to continue to see the video of George Floyd, for example, or the video of Hamlin. We need to remind ourselves of why this work is so important, even if it's not always hitting us directly home, right? But that's hard because when it's removed, we tend to allow it to remove, and then no longer are we necessarily motivated to make changes happen.
That's what's up, Dr. Tichenor. You've been, dropping some jewels today. We're going to bring you back. It's been good. I felt like I've been in a therapy session today.
You said that twice.
I said I do. Like, I kind of want to keep going. Like, we stop recording and I just want to keep talking. And cool. Like, is that just Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, and that's a Black Fathers Matter.
Black Fathers Matter. You wore that in Mason today?
I did. I wanted them to know that I was Black, even though it wasn't. It's not obvious. I got mohawk and all that.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, shout out to, I got my nephew out here too. He's in the back. Just out here doing the recording, supporting Chris Watson. So I wanted to shout him out. Been nice to see him out here. It's been a rough few months for the family. So glad to have him out here supporting the organization. And on that note, I'm going to throw it back to Payne to close us out.
Yes. So thank you once again, Dr. Tichenor, for joining us today. Really, really insightful stuff. For the audience, we'll be back in 2 weeks on the 26th. I want to wish everyone a happy MLK Day, and I hope that people use that time to reflect on what our ancestors have done for us as a community, and outside of MLK, just all the work that was done in the past and where we're going in the future. So this is another episode of Lifting Our Voices, the BMEA Podcast. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
You are now listening
to the Black Male Educators Alliance podcast.
Lifting our voices.
Lifting our voices.